Christmas Eve at Hohenfels Castle. Light rain was drizzling against the windscreen. The headlights of oncoming cars were reflected on the wet road, impairing my sight. I hated it when their glaring light dazzled me. Thank God there was little traffic today on Christmas Eve. A quick glance on the dashboard showed me it was 6 p.m. The church service had only lasted till 5 p.m. today, but the congregation I belonged to was situated quite a distance from our home. It was not much further to drive now, though. They would already be waiting, my parents and siblings. Most probably the tree had meanwhile been decorated and everything had been prepared for the festivity. Wafts of mist were drifting through the valley to my right. Another not white Christmas, I thought in passing. Rather a rainy, misty Christmas. I was not in much of a Christmas mood anyway, and the church service had not been able to change that. Trying to remember the pastor's words, I could recall the obligatory story with the manger, of course, and something about joy and peace. The latter were rather abstract terms as far as I was concerned, since I could not really relate to them. I had never exactly experienced them as reality myself, and looking around, I could not imagine that they actually existed in this world. What else had the sermon and subsequent prayer been about? Something with a heart of stone that should be exchanged for a heart of flesh. That had not particularly impressed me either, for I did have a heart of flesh after all. Regrettably so, since sometimes it would be much more advantageous and agreeable to have a heart of stone. Vigorously I shook my hair out of my face, as if this action could suppress the heavy thoughts that had surfaced, and straightened the wide sleeves of my light, figure-hugging, purple woolen mantle that had slipped slightly out of place. To celebrate the occasion, I had put on some of my medieval garments today, a dainty skirt and blouse in woodland green with red embellishments. I felt more comfortable in these clothes than in those I had to wear to work, even more comfortable than in the black clothes I usually wore during the winter months. The only piece of jewelry I had decided to put on was a pendant in the form of a cross-shaped flower set with garnets and a pearl in the center. I had not received any compliments for this attire at church, rather astonished if not estranged looks, if I had been taken notice of at all, but ultimately I did not care much about what others thought of me anyway. Suddenly I was fed up with brooding over people. At least for tonight, I wanted to shove away the thoughts of them all. My family who did not understand me, my partner who kept disappointing and hurting me, whom I found myself unable to love as I should because we did not really fit together. Friends and acquaintances who made me believe to some extent that they were interested in me, yet did not really want to have a closer knowledge of what made me so different from them. Positive dimensions they could not relate to, negative dimensions they did not even want to be confronted with. Most of all, however, I was desperate to avoid memories of the past, of people I never needed to see again, who nevertheless haunted my sleepless nights. Away with all these thoughts. I would simply forget and move on. I did not want to be cross with anybody, much less hate anyone. Perhaps my heart really had turned to stone by now. At least it did not have any strength left to deal with everything. Did I want a different heart? One capable of feeling as deeply as I used to? One able to love in spite of all injury? Lost in thoughts, I was contemplating the scenery. To my left, the town of Hohenfels was stretching across the valley, a mixture of old and new houses sparsely hidden behind bare trees. Sharply, the slate-covered roof of the church's slender bell tower was looming into the evening sky. Every moment now, the castle of Hohenfels was bound to appear high up on the hilltop, a ruin whose imposing, flood-lighted form I always loved to catch a glimpse of when driving home in the dark. To the right side of the street, high fir trees were endlessly fading away into the mist. Far ahead, on the edge of my vision, just now a dark shadow was breaking away from the trees. I slowed down, and the shadow took form, stretched out an arm. A hitchhiker? On Christmas Eve? I thought, astonished. I never pick up hitchhikers, especially not when I'm alone, and least of all at night. Far too dangerous. I had almost come up to his level now, and was eyeing him curiously. The muted colors of his clothes were merging with the backdrop of the forest, but I would not have been able to pay much attention to them anyway. His pale, narrow face, framed by black hair, seemed to shine out from the surrounding darkness in a way that immediately captured my imagination. Delicately chiseled yet soft features and sable, expressive eyes were recognizable with surprising clarity despite the speed with which I approached. Oh my God, I thought, if ever I have had something of an idea of my dream man, it is exactly this. Drive on, I shouted to myself, activated the indicator, stepped on the brakes, and turned into the little lay-by. I rolled down the window beside the passenger seat, and the large eyes held mine. Green, not black, I thought. Or grey? Could you give me a lift for a short distance, please? His voice was low and melodic, slightly wistful. Incautious, I silently chided myself. Injudicious. You know what you have already experienced. You know exactly what you're frightened of. Come on, drive on. Where do you want me to take you? Just a few miles down the road. With shaking hands, I opened the door latch, let him in, and pulled away. Silence. In spite of the noise of the engine, I thought I could hear my heart beating wildly, until it slowly calmed down more and more the longer nothing happened. Furtively, I shot a glance sideways at my passenger. His clothes looked rather ragged, and as if they stemmed from a different century, yet he was sitting upright, and his profile expressed a certain dignity, if not aloofness. As if he had noticed my scrutiny, he suddenly turned around to me and mustered me solemnly. At the next stop you can drop me off, unless you would like to drive me up to the castle. His intense eyes held my gaze for far too long, until I forced myself to pay attention to the road again. The castle. Hohenfels? Do you live there? Sometimes, among other places. I'm going to drop him off at the corner. I know there's a little lay-by there, I thought resolutely, while already taking the turning that led towards the medieval remains. Narrow and full of bends, the small road was winding its way up the hill past meadows and dark silhouettes of fruit trees, then meandering onwards beneath tall oaks, beeches, and fir trees. Yellow, warm, and mysterious, the castle ruin was shining through the trees, welcoming us, its graceful Gothic windows with their beautiful, partly broken rosettes almost seeming to call me, and I knew now that I would not stop until we had reached the parking lot in front of the building. I expected him to leave the car immediately, but part of me was not surprised anymore when he remained seated and looked at me. Do you know the castle? I used to spend time there long ago as a child, but I cannot remember in detail. I always see it from below, from the thoroughfare. I laughed nervously. I saw him smile for the first time. May I show it to you? Well, all right. I could hardly believe I had really said that. He exited the car so quickly that he was able to hold open the door of the driver's seat for me and extended his hand to help me get out. I smiled at him. In my medieval clothes that I knew suited me, I almost felt like a princess at this act of courtesy. In any case, the feelings of inferiority I usually felt in the presence of handsome men were kept within reasonable limits. Silently, we stepped through the arched entrance gate into the dark ruin. On the inside, far from the glare of the floodlights, the massive walls, with their high, jagged edges somberly set off against the night sky, almost appeared menacing. I was cold, and involuntarily I shivered. Without a word, my companion unclasped his cloak, took it off, and placed it around my shoulders. A half-decayed stairway led through several arches and passageways into a vast hall whose walls were still largely intact, only the roof was missing. At the opposite side I noticed a kind of tier or pedestal on which several stones were lying, almost completely covered in brambles and fallen leaves. This once used to be the throne room. I gave a start, having been so absorbed in contemplating the ruin that I had almost forgotten the man beside me. This is where all important ceremonies took place. He looked deeply in my eyes. Come. I followed him to the raised stone slab, which had probably been a foundation for a throne in former times. My companion turned around and looked at me once more. In the near darkness of the room, his eyes seemed almost black. Mysterious and inscrutable like this ruin. Unfathomable like the past that had once animated this throne room. And still even more mesmerizing than that. I could not avert my gaze. Neither of us spoke a word, and yet he seemed to look through my eyes right into my soul and read its secrets, dive deep down into it unto its very bottom. I stood motionless, as if spellbound. I found myself wishing that I had a heart as soft as water, so that it could flow away from me and stream into those dark eyes, to explore their mystery like they explored mine, to sink into their depths like they sank into mine. Part of me chided myself for my overly vivid imagination. Nevertheless, I had a feeling that something was happening between us in that moment, something like a wordless agreement. Suddenly I noticed that he took my left hand gently into both of his hands. His skin felt warm and silken, and the sight of his long, slender fingers, which I became aware of now for the first time, made me go weak at the knees almost as much as their touch. I felt something cold on my ring finger. Then he raised my hand to his lips and gently kissed it, his gaze all the while never leaving mine. A bit too hastily I tore away my hand, and looking at it, I saw a golden ring made in the likeness of a lily, whose stem was winding around my finger, and whose flower, wrought of some white metal, flashed in the pale moonlight. It was utterly beautiful. Quizzically I stared at the stranger, but he only pointed to the right with a vague gesture of his arm. Go through this arch, and you will reach a secret chamber. The king's chamber. The king's chamber? What was it used for? He merely smiled and said nothing. Then he simply went through the arch. I followed him with pounding heart. Slowly I groped my way through a small winding passage, then another spacious doorway, lifted my eyes, and froze on the spot awestruck. These were no half-dilapidated walls of a ruin, overgrown with fern and mosses and lashed by the rain. I saw a perfectly intact room through whose roof no glimpse of the sky was visible and whose floor was dry and clean of fallen leaves. In alcoves, below small, narrow windows, inset with discreetly colored stained glass, there were wrought iron candlesticks in filigreed floral designs. Beeswax candles flickered slightly in the draught, immersed the room in a warm golden, unsteady light, and suffused the air with a fragrance of honey. On the floor, near the opposite wall, I noticed a settee with pillows made of heavy, colorfully woven and richly embroidered cloth, reminding me of the unicorn tapestries found in English or French castles of the 15th century. Gingerly I took a step forward, and a ponderous, golden-red curtain of similar design fell behind me across the door-frame. Suddenly my companion was beside me, lifted me in his arms, and carried me to the couch, where he gently set me down. I stared at him speechlessly as he slowly bent over me. Carefully his fingers traced my cheek, and my eyelids closed instinctively. Strands of his long dark hair were stroking my face like silk when he bowed his head and gently kissed me on the forehead. His lips touched my closed eyelids, then delicately brushed my mouth. I moaned softly with longing. It had been such a long time since someone had touched me in such a way, fascinated me in such a way, someone for whom I felt such love. Indeed, I could deny it no longer. I had lost my heart, lost it to a stranger whose name I did not even know. His kisses became more intimate, and his hands were gliding along my body. Even though I was still fully dressed, I felt them on my naked skin. They were flowing over my limbs like choice aromatic oils of sandalwood and roses. However, his touch was not reduced to the surface of my body. His hands went deeper into me, through me, as if I was a ghost. Like fiery waves, they were caressing my insides, and I yielded myself fully to the emotions they kindled, letting myself be borne away on their currents. All I wanted was to abandon myself to him. Now his hands had wandered up to my heart and seemed to linger indecisively. "Take it," my mute thoughts pleaded. "Let it be yours forever." The ardently awaited fingers came closer, wafted around my heart like a tender breeze, flared up like flames in a gust of wind, and then suddenly closed around my heart in a firm, safe, inescapable hold. Slightly scared, my eyelids fluttered open. I saw a hand seize my heart and wrench it out of my breast. The other hand fetched a different heart, apparently out of nowhere, and set it in the now vacant space. Panic-stricken, I sat up. What had I said? What had he done? It was my heart, and I did not want to lose it completely. It shouldn't simply be gone like this. It had been with me for so long, after all. It was a part of me. Without it, I was incomplete. But it was too late. In a split second it had happened, and now he had vanished. "Come back!" I screamed. "You have betrayed me. You did all those things only so you could take my heart." Take it, and give me a new one. Wasn't that what I had prayed for in the church service earlier on, even if little more than half-heartedly? More importantly, wasn't that what I had agreed to in a silent plea with eloquent eyes just a little while ago over there in the throne room? What just a few seconds ago, under the spell of his hands, my whole being had yearned for? My heart of stone for his heart of flesh. I was lying in the dark, in a nothingness, without vision. But something was different. I felt him, around me, in me, and I trusted him. All fear was gone. Somehow, everything was all right. Do with me whatever you want. I am yours. Wilted leaves were rustling in the winter wind, and I shivered. The air smelled of night and rain. He would return. He was unpredictable, full of surprises beyond all imagination, but he would come back, in his own peculiar way, exceeding all expectations. Just like he had come, this I now knew, in this night over 2,000 years ago for the first time. And somehow he was with me even now, and I knew he loved me. No one else would he ever encounter in the exact same way. Slowly I opened my eyes. My head had sunk onto the steering wheel, and through the half-open car window slight rain came drizzling in, which had already made my hair rather clammy. I heard the noise of a passing car rise to a crescendo and then ebb away, but it sounded far off and seemed to come from somewhere below me. For a moment I had completely lost my orientation. Then, looking through the right side window, I became aware of the remains of high walls. Hohenfels Castle. The last thing I could remember clearly was admiring its silhouette from the thoroughfare. I must have been so absorbed in my meditations that I must have taken the turn to the castle by mistake. Dazed, I shook myself awake and started the engine. The dashboard lights went on and told me it was 7 p.m. Tired as I had been, I must have stopped at the castle's parking lot and fallen asleep. And what a bizarre dream I had had. Bit by bit, snippets of memories came back, as if I would ever give a lift to a hitchhiker, and all that had followed, simply absurd. Candles and tapestries in the ancient ruin. I grinned, yet at the same time turned around a bit uncomfortably, feeling goosebumps rise on my arms. Suddenly I wanted to go home, to my family. For this evening I had enough of mystery and romance. I longed to sit beneath the decorated tree, together with familiar faces, doing nothing more than watching the candles burn down and letting roast apples melt in our mouths. I wanted to show them they were important to me. Who knew how much time there was still left? At the door, my little sister greeted me, bouncing up and down with excitement. Impulsively, I took her in my arms and breathed a kiss on her hair. "Hello, sweetie. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Eleanor. Have you brought a present for me?" She wriggled free of my embrace, her eyes scanning the bag at my side. Then her fingers suddenly clasped my left hand instead, holding it closely up to her face. "Oh my goodness, what a beautiful ring! Wherever did you get that from?"